Long ago, underneath Minecraftia's snowy mountains lay the 7 dwarven kingdoms. Each faction was connected underneath the tall, snowy mountains, and each faction thrived. The first and most humble faction held great ties to the end. The second, more flamboyant faction held great relations with the Nether and welcomed piglin trades. The third housed the most scholarly of the dwarves. The fourth became the home to the master blacksmiths who welcomed those with a thirst for wanting to learn the trade. The fifth held the responsibility of traveling to the surface and trading for food in exchange for the goods they had to offer with the villagers. The sixth faction housed redstone experts, mechanical and technological prowess that no other faction held. The seventh and centermost dwarven kingdom held the most power, and yet war never broke among the factions. The seventh faction brought all the factions together, and was the most prosperous as miners typically kept the faction's economy thriving. Any ores a faction had too many of would be traded to factions with too little ores to work with. Peace reigned over the underground, trades were good, and all the factions prospered. And then one day, one of the royal scientists in the 7th faction, otherwise known as the Great Faction, got curious. He wondered if there were more realms beyond just the End and the Nether. He wondered if there could be a portal to a new realm built and then put in the center point of the city, and have that be the entry point to it. He dove headfirst into his studies, his thirst for knowledge and an insatiable urge to see if his hypothesis was correct. He received a blessing from the king of the dwarves to continue with his studies, and was thus appointed to the role of interdimensional scientist. The scientists gather a crew of scholars, and together they research what they could find. But nothing would come up save for texts involving the Nether and the End respectively. The scientists soon became frustrated and jaded. Why wasn't there any information involving any other realm? Were the End and the Nether the only realms in Minecraftia? What's beyond the scope of the 3 realms that were in complete harmony? And how could he find the possible 4th realm? One night, the jaded scientist walked around the empty city streets alone. It was quiet, as all the dwarves were asleep. That was until he encountered a tall, cloaked man. "I heard you were trying to find new realms," the cloaked man said. The scientist looked at the man, whose eyes were covered. "Yes, I am. What of it?" The scientist cautiously asked. Something about the cloaked man was ringing alarm bells in his head. "I can help you." The scientist continued to remain skeptical. "How?" The cloaked man procured a large, heavy, and ancient tome. The leather covering scratched and torn on the corners. The leather strap no longer latched onto the clasp that kept the book closed, and a strange symbol was burned into the leather cover. The scientist gingerly took the book away from the cloaked man, who spoke again. "There is another realm, and this tome has the answers you seek. If you will allow me to, I would like to assist you." The scientist couldn't help but become excited, his heart racing at the prospect of being one step closer to his goal. His excitement overshadowed the screaming alarm bells in his head. He looked up and nodded his head. "Yes, you are welcome to help. I will provide you shelter and whatever you need in exchange for your help." The cloaked man chuckled. "Then it's a deal." Weeks would pass and progress would be made. The scientist threw himself into his work alongside the cloaked man. However, the crew the scientist hired became very wary of the cloaked man. They had concerns they so desperately tried to convey to the royal scientist, but their concerns fell on deaf ears. The royal scientist snapped. "We are this close to our goal," he shouted. "This man has proven to be a valuable asset." "But sir," one of the other scientists spoke, "you don't even know his name. His eyes are concealed. You and him. Your work has consumed you." But the scientist snapped once more. "And? Sir, you need to stop this project immediately, for your mental health and for the sake of our faction. I refuse to stop now, and if I have to do this alone, I will. You're all fired." The royal scientist turned away and continued to build the massive portal alongside the cloaked man. The royal scientist became isolated, getting closer to the man who gave him the book. The cloaked man would feed the scientist lies, praise, and empty promises, telling him that he's making a great effort, that he'll be the first dwarf to step foot into this new realm, the first to make contact with the inhabitants of the new realm. Then came the day the portal was complete. The cloaked man and the royal scientist stood proud as a crowd gathered. Before the scientist could give a speech, the king appeared. Concerned, the king desperately tried to get through to his most favored scientist that he saw the contents of the book the scientist had. He pleaded with him, not wanting anything to happen to his beloved kingdom. He told the scientist that the man he was working with is a threat to the kingdom, and that he was the white-eyed man. The scientist's eyes widened as the cloaked man chuckled. "You're very perceptive, Your Majesty." The cloaked man lowered his hood and confirmed the king's worries as he began to raise a hand to the newly made portal. The scientist, realizing his error too late, tried to stop him, but the white-eyed man didn't listen. "Oh, little dwarf, I believe it's time for a new dawn for this kingdom." The man opened the portal and all hell broke loose. Horrifying creatures made of skulk attacked the dwarves. The king fought them in order to protect his subjects, ordering an evacuation, while the scientist tried to go after the white-eyed man. But he smirked and left, closing the portal as he did and leaving everything to fall into chaos. Seeing a skull creature about to attack the king, the scientist leapt in front of him, taking the hit himself. He screamed in pain and fell to his knees. The king picked him up and continued to fight off the creatures. It was a brutal fight, but all of the skulk monsters were defeated. A quarter of the population had been slaughtered and many injured, including the royal scientist. Fearing he would die to his injuries, the scientist apologized profusely to the king after he ordered his people to take the injured to the medical ward. But the king looked at the scientist, a gentle look in his eyes. "Rest now. I forgive you for going astray." This would be the last kind thing the king would say to the scientist. After a week, that's when strange things began to happen. Those who had been injured, including the royal scientist, began to act strange. They became more sensitive to sound as they slowly lost their sight. The scientist felt the worst of this strange phenomenon. He felt a searing pain all over his body, his mind full of irrational thoughts, and an insatiable urge for one thing: souls. It was unbearable. He couldn't understand what was going on. He was hurting, and all he hungered for were souls. Then, one fateful day, the king came to check on the scientist. Although the king wasn't happy with what the scientist had done previously, he truly did forgive him. But when the king came into the room, that was when the scientist's mind became clouded with murderous rage. Succumbing to his urges, the scientist wasted no time in murdering the king and consuming his soul. The scientist felt relief, but it was temporary as he craved more souls. He didn't notice that his body felt a small change. He wouldn't be the only one to experience such changes, as those who were injured also began their rampage. The injured, now understood too late to have been infected by the skulk, massacred everyone who remained, all except a small dwarven child who ran away to the surface. Over time, the more the infected dwarves consumed souls, the more they went through the painful transformation into creatures known as wardens. Eventually, the wardens were all that remained in the kingdom. The scientist, now completely transformed, looked the most different compared to most wardens. He stood much taller than the rest of his fellow wardens. Amethyst clusters jutted out from his shoulders in the most painful way. There were more amethysts scattered around his body. He is different. Kneeling onto his knees after the painful transformation, the scientist coughed up an echo shard. This would be the only thing that remained of the scientist's true self and his past. Panting heavily, the scientist didn't notice that the white-eyed man had returned. "My, you look wonderful, dear friend," the white-eyed man says in a mocking tone. The scientist looked up and growled. "What are you doing here?" He roared out of pain and anger, wincing as he felt his sound sensitivity become affected by his own roaring. The white-eyed man smirked and held up a crown made of stone inlaid with amethyst. "To crown the new king, of course," he said before placing the crown on the scientist. "No, the Warden King's head. Because you are the king now, the king of the skulk, the king of the wardens. This is, after all your fault, and the rest of the factions will fall along with this one. And you will be the king of that ruin." Distraught, the Warden King tried to attack the white-eyed man, but he swiftly dodged. "Until we meet again, Your Majesty." The white-eyed man quickly disappeared before the Warden King's attack could land. Frustrated and full of pain and regret, the Warden King cried out. His cries of sorrow and regret rang throughout the ruined city, summoning the wardens who watched as he fell to his knees once again. He brought this upon his people, his own home. He knew full well that the other factions will meet the same fate. It's all his own fault. And now he has to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. Many decades would go by, and all 7 factions have fallen. The once prosperous civilizations turned into ruins infested with skulk, and no monsters dared to go near in fear of being absorbed into the skulk and furthering its corruption. You and Amontif, after being briefed by a much older lone survivor of the 7th faction, are tasked to encounter the Warden King and ease his sorrows in order to restore the harmony of Minecraftia. Although you two do not get along, you both journey down the long abandoned cave leading to the ruins. As you did so, you two bickered the whole time, forgetting a dire warning the survivor gave about keeping quiet. But you two continued to bicker, ignoring the alarming shrieks from the shriekers and the sensors surrounding you both as you walked along the empty streets of a once prosperous kingdom. But then, the bell in the abandoned bell tower rings, causing you both to freeze. You hear the sound of something rising from the skulk as the bell continues to ring, loud and proud, causing all the shriekers to go off in a frenzy. That is when you two remembered one very, very dire warning when it came time to encounter the Warden King. Ask not for whom the bell tolls.